Okay, we've got a politicians panel discussion for you now, which is going to be chaired by Andew Charlesworth. So I'll hand over to him, and after that, then we'll be doing the group workshop after a short coffee break. We'll then do the campaigning workshop altogether in well, I'm not sure where I'll be at, we'll do that probably in here as well. Okay, if I can hand you over now to Andew.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you all for coming today. This sort of session is the political session. We're going to be talking about the role of politicians in oversight and accountability when it comes to the production of new government databases, when it comes to the collection of personal data, of information about citizens.
Sorry, you're talking about the oversight and accountability, you say, of systems that are already in place. Is that what you're going to be talking about?
No.
Or are you talking about actually resisting those things?
Yeah, accountability and oversight should take place before you even have something in place.
But that assumes that it's going to come into place long before you should put in anything. If you're assuming accountability and oversight,
it doesn't assume anything of the sort. What we're saying is that there should be informed debate about the purpose of databases, why they are being put forward, and whether the purposes for which they're going to be used are proportionate. So there leaves plenty of role in there for activism, there leaves plenty of role in there for resistance.
Can we start with
Can we? Yes. Thank you very much. I'm going to start with our first brief speaker, Stephen Williams, MP, please.
Thank you. I can tell you're not necessarily going to be a compliant and easy audience. Well, we'll see. Well, congratulations for coming anyway, whatever your motivation is. I don't know whether there are many Economist readers in the room. I am one, but yesterday's Economist described this convention, or certainly the London meeting of it, as a gathering of Britain's finest eccentrics. So you must be in Bristol, the West Country's gathering of finest eccentrics. On Thursday, when I was still in London, I went to the final few days of the British Library's exhibition on Taking Liberties, which is an amazing exhibition, although if you haven't had time to see it, I'm afraid it's now too late because it closes this afternoon. But it tells the story of the accumulation of British liberties all the way through from 1215 if you're English and you think Magna Carta is the starting point, or if like me you're Welsh and you think the laws of Harold Dahl, which are actually rather more progressive, which were in the 980s, are the accumulation of some of our civil liberties, right up to the present day, when those liberties are perhaps being eroded by the government of the day. And they gave each person who went to the exhibition, just like when you go to a concert, one of these wristbands, and I'm number 167554 with my own barcode. There's a sense of irony there, but that's how many people they had to the exhibition. It says, this citizen number is unique to you. And if you want to look at the website about it anyway, if you can't go to the exhibition, it's www.blbritish.uk/taking liberties. And it's an amazing exhibition to see in a virtual sense as well as in the physical sense that I actually saw it. Well, in the last decade, certainly, and possibly before that as well, those civil liberties have certainly been eroded by the party in power. And there's been a gradual extension of state authority and the trampling on the rights of the citizen. And most noticeably, the terror laws, the laws against terrorism that the current government has enacted, and there's been a steady stream of them in the period that I've been an MP, and certainly for the time before as well, have been used for purposes for which they were never originally intended. So you've had terrorism laws being used to gag hecklers at public meetings, at Labour Party conferences, most famously, to arrest and fine for £300 an elderly lady who all she was doing was reading out the names of the war dead in Iraq at, of all places, the Cenotaph in Whitehall, or to follow parents, snoop on parents and follow them around when what they were doing, misguided as it was trying to find the best place, best primary school to send their children, something that is topical in Bristol at the moment. Now, terrorism is absolutely a threat. And of course, we've had people arrested on suspicion of terrorism right here in Bristol, in Easton, and in Westbury-on-Trim. And what those individuals from the briefings I had from the police were perhaps doing was quite frightening. We do have to be vigilant against that, but we must not have a completely disproportionate response to the threat that is against us. We are now the most watched and controlled society in the Western world because of a war that largely we cannot control and usually cannot see or foresee. And I think that's at the heart of the debate that we should be having today. We're for those reasons that yesterday my party, the Liberal Democrats, published a freedom bill, which you can find on our website, which lists 20 laws that we would either repeal in their entirety or seriously roll back in order to reclaim some of our freedoms. And just some examples is the right to protest. There's the control of the DNA database. We have the largest accumulation of human information in the world, even larger than the information that the United States holds about its citizens. Proper laws and regulations for the control of CCTV. We are one of the most watched groups of people in the world. Laws to defend whistleblowers who think that because they're civil servants perhaps and they come across something that the state is doing that they really should not be doing, they should be protected if they expose what a minister or a senior civil servant is doing against the interests of the citizen. And we would restore the period for pre-charge detention, not to 42 days, not to 28 days, but back to 14 days, which in itself is still quite one of the longest periods for pre-charge detention in the world. The top of the list is repealing in its entirety the Identity Cards Act 2006. Now, I voted against that bill back in 2006, even though I was under doctor's orders to stay at home because I'd managed to make it all the way to the age of 39 and then got struck down with chickenpox, which, for those of you who've not had chickenpox as an adult, is pretty debilitating, and I wasn't meant to go out at all. But I was absolutely determined that when it came to it, my name would be recorded in the no column in the division lobby and in Hansard as voting against the Identity Cards Bill, and that was one of the key promises I made in the 2005 general election. But in that election, it was actually quite hard to get people interested in this whole issue of the threat to our civil liberties. And I know whether any of you listened to the radio discussion on Radio Bristol this morning that I and Dave Gould and a Liberal Democrat councillor were on, when the presenter repeatedly said, but what if you've done nothing wrong? Surely there's nothing to be afraid of. If you've done nothing wrong, why shouldn't you be watched? Why shouldn't you carry a card? What's wrong with a policeman asking you for your identity if you've got nothing to be afraid of? And I think that's a simplistic argument that we have to knock down again and again. Now, in 2005, it was quite hard to knock it down because the ID cards legislation was a Labour proposal at that time. It's now an act, but it's not yet in force. But by the time of the next general election, which could be sometime this year, but more likely to be next year, it'll be on the brink of coming into force. And I think it's the duty of all of us, whether we're Liberal Democrats, Greens, possibly Conservatives or people from other political parties, to speak against and try and excite some real interest in this issue amongst our fellow citizens, and to make civil liberties a big dividing line issue in the next general election, and have a campaign where we all try and promote a society where the citizen is paramount. Now, the Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, is actually in Bristol today. He's just a few miles away from here in Filton, and I understand from radio news I've heard he's been talking about the economic hurricane that's blowing through the Western world and through the global economy at the moment. I think he should be rather more concerned about the icy blast that he and his government ministers have blown through our civil liberties for the last 10 years. When I started off as a teenager in politics 20 years ago, the dividing lines then were in between left and right in politics, between the West, between the Soviet Union, between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. All of those things are now pretty much irrelevant. But I think a key dividing line now is in between authoritarian politicians and those that believe in the rights of the citizen. And I would say Liberals are obviously at the heart of that. Now, it's certainly be part of my claim at the next general election that liberalism is the sole and most meaningful guarantee of civil liberties in this country. I'm sure we're about to have a robust debate about who can genuinely claim that, but it's certainly a debate that we must make sure is at the heart of our national discussion over the next 12 to 18 months. Thanks for listening.
Is Dr. Mark Wright.
Thank you very much, Andrew. My name is Mark Wright. I'm another Lib Dem politician. I'm a councillor for the city centre, which is called Cllr Ward, and I'm also a parliamentary candidate for Bristol South. But my profession is a software engineer, and in my particular aspect of software engineering is that I'm a database engineer. And I have a great deal of experience in building and managing and designing databases to deal with huge amounts of data on huge amounts of people. For 6 years, in fact, I worked on a giant database for a company which will remain nameless, a performance-related pay scheme for 20,000 of their engineers, which measured and took note of everything that they did during the day in order to put together what they were doing and how well they were doing and calculate how much money they needed. And it's that, among other things, which has made me so passionate about this, because I am particularly worried about what I would call function creep and mission creep, which we see in many of the things the government is doing in IT, because, to be perfectly honest, it's my day job. I do it. Managers come to me and they say, I've got a new idea, can you do it? And I tell them, yes, I can. And not only that, I can do all this extra stuff as well. Now, of course, I do that inside a private company, and I do it for entirely legitimate reasons, because these people are working for that company, but I know full well that that kind of thing happens in every database, in every circumstance. In 2005, I managed to get an anti-ID cards motion through the council and passed by the council, declaring the council to be against ID cards. Just a couple of months ago, I got another motion through the council. It was possible to get a more beefy and stronger motion through the council this time, because I'm very pleased that our Conservative colleagues have hardened their opinions against ID cards since I got the last one through, and I had to water it down back then. But this was a much stronger motion, and it also included stating that the council was against, for example, fingerprinting of children in schools and fingerprinting of punters on their way into clubs. Both of those are things now which are rising up the agenda. We have fingerprinting in schools in this city, in several schools, at least 4 or 5. Generally, it seems for things like taking out library books or buying lunch. You might think that that's astonishing. Which adult would ever give their fingerprint over to buy a sandwich at lunch? None. Absolutely right. But for kids, this is okay, it seems. The issue with fingerprinting punters in bars has not come to Bristol yet, and hopefully it never will now that this motion is passed. But in other cities, there has been pressure for fingerprinting of punters in bars. I think it's because the licensing trade knows that it will have no effect whatsoever on sales, and it's pushed as a way which will cut down on binge drinking. And I think the licensing trade knows that it will have no effect on that, so they're quite happy to see it. I was at a course in Whitehall, an IT course in Whitehall, a couple of weeks ago. I was wanting to hear about open source software and how it could be applied better in government and local government. Sadly, it wasn't about that at all. But it turned out to be very interesting, because what it did turn out to be about was the sharing of information between departments, and why information sharing inside government and local government was so important. And one of the things that was very noticeable, because I was one of the few politicians there. This was in Whitehall. It was a very posh centre, full of lots of high-powered, very well-paid civil servants from mid-ranks of Whitehall and various councils. And it was quite clear, because they used the phrase in some of their speeches, privacy lobby, that they consider privacy aspects to be an irritation that are to be managed, not to be an integral part of the way that they look at dealing with information. At one point, one of the speakers said that one of the reasons to ensure good data integrity and security of systems was to prevent the kind of outrages we've had of data loss, which lead to stirring up the privacy lobby. I was sitting at the back all this time, cringing, because it was quite obvious to me that people like us are an irritation to those people, and that is the mindset in Whitehall at the moment, and that is what we have to deal with in local government and in national government when we're looking at these things. I'd just like to end up and say that another future worry of mine is road user charging. And it's something which I'm very torn on, because I like the idea of what road user charging can bring, because it can bring rationing of road use, and in principle I'm an environmentalist and I think that we need to sort out congestion. But I simply do not trust this government to manage that data and to design it from the start in a way which absolutely guarantees the anonymity and the protection of people who are using the roads, because the reality of road user charging is that it means that all of us will be tracked in our directions through life. I don't trust the current government to even consider that to be a problem. I think that they would consider it to be an opportunity, and that scares the life out of me. And I think that this is another battle that we're going to have to be fighting soon. It's another extension of the whole database issues that we will be covering this afternoon. And then there's a saying in database engineering: if the answer to your question is another database, then you're asking the wrong question. On that note, I'd like to finish. Thank you.
Brilliant, okay. When I first got involved in politics, I was quite young. It was around the poll tax, and I think what we happened through the 80s were attacks on our collective rights, the rights for trade unions to organise, etc., etc. But now, under New Labour, we've had more assaults on our individual rights, and bringing up all this data that the government's getting on us. Quite a lot of it can be passed over to private companies, what they call data sharing. One thing I read about Tesco's, for example, was Tesco's have got more data on people than the Stasi had in East Germany, although East Germany only had 16 million people. Not that Tesco's are yet sending people around to Duffy. I don't agree with them, of course, but I don't want to say too much on this, so I'll just hand it over to the next person.
That's the way in the Green Party. We like debate, we don't like spending too long talking. Could I start by exercising my right not to be filmed, please?
Yeah, you certainly
Especially
can.
since you didn't ask up here.
I'd like to move on, please, to Zehra Zaidi, who's the Conservative candidate.
I am indeed. Hello. As has just been stated, my name is Zehra, and I'm one of the Conservative MEP candidates for the South West. Now, my colleague Charlotte will probably talk more about national issues, but before I rile against the erosion of civil liberties, I want to say one thing. I, more than anyone else, want to fight against measures, things like extremism, illegal immigration, all the rest of it. I actually come from a family back home in Asia and the Middle East who were involved in politics and the military, and we fought battles on these very issues. But I am also a conservative, and since time immemorial, there's always had to be a balance to be struck between liberty and the rights of the individual and security. And you'd be very surprised to say, very surprised to hear me say that I believe that the balance is tipped way too far towards a state and against the individual. And as a result, we've had a loss of our privacy, an erosion of our liberties, and certainly a loss of our human rights. And this is from a government that claims to be the guardian of human rights. Now, there are lots of European issues that I could highlight. I'm going to probably go through three very briefly, and in a collective discussion we can talk about them in a bit more detail. The first touches on a national issue, data retention. And the EU Data Retention Directive is probably one of the clearest examples of how policies are often laundered into our own national system. Slowly, data retention became more and more onerous. You had a mandatory system. You've now got a mandatory system in place, and that really started off an idea that germinated here in national governments. And then they went to Europe, passed legislation via directive, which then could be transposed back into national law. Now this now makes things, before it was voluntary. It's a very complicated area, so I'm trying to go through the directive piece by piece. It's not very easy, but basically, to make it very simple, it was voluntary for telephone companies and internet service providers to hold records. Under this system, it now becomes mandatory. So you're not just talking about a big brother state, but a big brother Europe, which is really quite terrifying. The other area that I wanted to highlight was a recently negotiated intergovernmental treaty called the Prüm Treaty, which talks about police cooperation, the result of which means that foreign authorities can engage in hot pursuit into Britain without having to go to the procedures we once had. They can also access our records. It's very worrying, and possibly as someone who is standing for the European Parliament, what's most worrying is that the consultation process within the only democratically elected organisation in Europe, the European Parliament, only lasted 3 months, and that, quite frankly, is a disgrace. The final area that I want to highlight, which has probably had the most press in Britain, is the whole issue around trials in absentia, which my Green colleague has raised, and also the European arrest warrant. We've had an erosion of a fundamental principle of our English law, habeas corpus, along with countless other slow erosions. But trials in absentia, that whole issue is probably, to me, one of the most critical aspects as to what's happening at the European level, because you can be extradited, you can be charged, you can be arrested for committing something you didn't even know you committed in another EU country, whether it's fraud, whether it's not paying your bill, and you will not even know about it. But there's a second issue. If you look at, I've got to be very careful not to go into too much detail, but the way authorities can even comply with that legislation is quite worrying. For example, as a Brit, I would expect that, say, if in Romania I'm all hauled up on charges, I would want a fully qualified lawyer who speaks fluent English. You can, under the system at place, all that they really have to do is have someone who speaks rudimentary English, and it's all fine. So there are a whole raft of measures at the EU level that we really need to guard against. Cooperation is key, discussion is key, having the power to opt in when we want or opt out when we want is also key. But the main thing is that, we talked about the level of scrutiny and transparency. What I want to see is a greater ability for the European Parliament to scrutinise some of these measures coming into place. What I also want to see is for us here in Britain to actually find out the true extent of what's going on and to be able to discuss it. If you just take the one occasion when we could have debated provisions, for example, that come from Europe, was the Lisbon Treaty, and we saw how much parliamentary scrutiny there was there. You're talking about a number of days, and these are provisions that will affect us. So we've reached a tipping point in terms of our civil liberties, and as the states become ever more overbearing, it's us, the ordinary individuals, who've lost out. That's all I want to say, really. Thank you very much.
Finally, Charlotte, let's see what's going to consider.
Hello, thank you very much, and my apologies for being late. I'd just like to say I've missed most of the speeches here, which I'm very sorry about, but what a great thing it is to see representatives from all sorts of political parties lined up in front of you here today. Because freedom is something that should be universal, it should be something that every single person can enjoy, and so if we are to fight for our freedom, all political parties are going to have to unite together and sing from the same hymn sheet. Now, the sad fact is, I think I've been given about 6 minutes to speak. If I was to go into every single way in which our freedom has been intruded upon in the last 10 years, I'm afraid I'd be here for a very long time, and you'll probably all get terribly bored. So I'm going to spare you that. I'm just going to give a very brief overview of what I think has been happening in recent years and what we should be doing to stop it. Over the last few years, we've seen ID cards brought onto the agenda, which will cost the taxpayer £20 million. We've seen an NHS database to gather every single detail about your health, which is most probably going to be able to be looked at by the receptionist and non-core clinical staff. The worst thing about this, in many ways, is that you can actually opt out of that database. But how many people know that? I'm sure civil servants know it. I'm sure government ministers know it. I happen to know it because I have one of my members of the family who works in the medical profession. But this is freedom from some, for some who are in the know and know how the system works, and lack of freedom for others who simply are led to believe that they have to give their details over to the NHS database. Now, I think that's double standards and that's unacceptable. But you'd think if you have a government that's particularly keen on taking people's details and particularly keen on information and knowing everything about everyone, you would at least think that they would be quite good at keeping on to hold of those details. But the sad fact is, as you well know, millions of details of our armed forces, of taxpayers, of children have fallen into the wrong hands. So it's against this climate that we see even more personal information, biometric information, gathered into a database which, frankly, I don't think any of us have any faith in whatsoever. And these are the simple things that make newspaper headlines every now and again, and that you can, to some extent, measure. But there's something else going on behind the scenes. Something that is very insidious, very stealthy, and which is something that most normal people, frankly, wouldn't have the time to find out about, and which the newspapers don't really have the time to go into detail about and make newspaper headlines on. And that is just how the government is fixing it, so it can take away our freedoms, take away our powers, through subtle parliamentary procedures. Now, as I said, I'm not going to bore you to tears with a whole catalogue of how this is being done, but I will recommend to you this very good document here. It's on www.modernliberty.net, and it's the Abolition of Freedom Act 2009, and that's a fantastic summary of all those very stealthy civil service ways in which parliamentary procedures and legislation has been changed, so that you won't even know that your freedom is being taken away. It's the www.modernliberty.net, and I'm sure people here, No2ID, will have the details for you if you want to get them afterwards. And it's a fascinating read. I won't go into it all now, but I do urge you to go home and have a look. And one of the more alarming things, I think, is as we see the current government administration desperately clinging on to power, desperately paranoid about erosions of its own authority, I think what we could well be seeing is a paranoid government pulling in power to itself, pulling in information to itself in a desperate attempt to stay afloat. Now, I'm just so very pleased that we have organisations like No2ID and Modern Liberty to keep an eye on this and to watch it, and I'm very pleased that we have a line-up of political parties here who all sing from the same hymn sheet. So thank you very much.
Our speakers have given us quite a lot to think about, and in my role as the chair, I have always understood this role as to introduce the speakers and then get the hell out of the way, so I'm going to get the hell out of the way and open the floor to questions. Can I have a question? Start with that question there.
It's a bit strange to me, the amount of times I've heard the word slow erosion today. Now, the fact is that rights that we've been fighting for and building up for about 1,000 years now have been lost in one short generation. What's also strange to me is that nobody seems to have mentioned economics. Now, Molly, you're an economist, aren't you?
I definitely mentioned economics.
I'd like to know what your thoughts are about how, my view anyway, is that this a supposed slow erosion, I'd say more of a radical transformation in our civil liberties, seems to be the final extension of what of the economic project began by Thatcherism and Reaganism in the 80s. Now, if you go back to social democracy, the Liberal Democrats are claiming that they're standing for the left. We don't have social democracy here anymore. Your economic policies still stand by the neoliberal projects started